The mainstream band Guns N' Roses has a song called Patience. Have a little patience. And I always thought it was an intriguing song for a band to write about. Marathon runners. We had a half marathon here in Russellville last weekend. It takes patience. It takes endurance. It takes sticking with it to be able to run their races. And so here in James chapter 5, where we are this week, James talks about this idea of patience and endurance in our faith several times. Patience is hard. It's not an easy thing. It's hard for us to wait on what God's timing may be versus ours. It's hard to let things play out. But ultimately, it's hard to trust God. But that's what we're asked to do. So he gives three patience analogies in James chapter 5, 7 through 12. And then he talks a little bit more about the idea of waiting and patience and so forth. Starting in verse 7, therefore, brothers and sisters, be patient until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth and is patient with it until it receives the early and late rains. You must also be patient, strengthening your hearts because the Lord's coming is near. Brothers and sisters, do not complain about one another so you will not be judged. Look, the judge stands at the door. Brothers and sisters, take the prophets who spoke in the Lord's name as an example of suffering and patience. See, we count as blessed those who have endured. You have heard of Job's endurance and have seen the outcome that the Lord brought about. The Lord is compassionate and merciful. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes mean yes and your no mean no, so that you won't fall under judgment. So he gives these three analogies of patience. And the first one is like a farmer waiting for the harvest. In an agriculturally based area, the farmer's dependent on the rain, and he can't control that. That's something that's out of his control. They're dependent on God for the weather. Too much rain can be a problem. Too little rain can be a problem. Frost can be a problem. Too much heat can be a problem. The process has to happen. They have to wait it out because they can't control it. He can't force the process, so he has to wait and wait with hope and wait with confidence. Similarly, for us, faith involves trusting God for the things that we can't control because we can't force the process and we can't force God's timing. We can't force things to happen the way that we want it to. We need to trust God with the things that we can't control and live faithfully and honor him with what we can control. We want to be found faithful for the things that we can control, with the things that we can control, instead of focusing so much on the things that we can't, which we tend to do a lot of times, don't we? We want to be faithful in the things that we can control. And it'll be worth it in the end in the things that we can't control if we endure, if we're patient. As the farmer can and does wait for the rain, so can we wait. So that's the first one, the patience like a farmer, waiting for the rains, waiting for the harvest. Be patient like a prophet speaking the truth. The Old Testament is full of prophets speaking. And as those prophets spoke, they often suffered, not for doing the wrong thing, but for doing the right thing. A lot of the things that they said didn't come to fruition immediately, but they knew that they were speaking God's truth to the people. James isn't saying suffering is an aberration or it's something new or whatever. The prophets and the people of old and the ancient followers of God faced suffering. It's a sign not of something wrong with a believer, but of something normal, something that we can get through, something that we can endure as so many others have before. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean inactivity. It doesn't mean we just sit around. The farmer keeps working, the prophet keeps speaking, keeps prophesying, and we persevere. We focus on the goodness and mercy of God and his glory even through our trials. And then third, be patient like Job, hoping in God's promise. If anybody went through it, it was Job. Job went through so much. He lost his land, he lost his money, he lost his kids, he lost everything he had. And he waited through the suffering, and God ultimately rewarded him in the end. When people are hurting, they often long for the return of Jesus. That's why we hear it in songs that we sing, and especially slavery and African-American hymns and stuff like that speak a lot of that type of thing. Suffering is not something that we want to face, but it's something that we have to believe there's a purpose ultimately. We have to believe that the presence of Christ will be made known through our suffering. Through all of Job's suffering, and he suffered like few, if any, ever have before, through all of his suffering, losing literally everything, he still hoped in God. He still remained faithful to God, knowing that his suffering wasn't the end. And God blessed him. It wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of a chapter in his life. God blessed him through the suffering, despite the suffering. And we can be patient, and we can hope, and we can believe in God's mercy and compassion and his purposes and so forth through our suffering. So be patient like Job, hoping in God's purpose. Why should we be patient? Job also talks about this idea. First, because the Lord is coming. And there's several other verses that we could point to here. 1 Peter 4:7, 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18, 2 Peter 3:10 through 12, and others speak of the coming of the Lord. Early Christians lived as if they believed that Jesus was coming back very soon in their lifetime. They believed that he could return at any moment. And James encourages us to see our suffering in light of the bigger picture, in light of the fact that he's going to come back. This can be a source of comfort. This can be a source of hope through our difficulty, through our suffering. We can endure because we know that our judge is coming. We know that our Savior is coming. We can stand firm because of the reality of the return of Christ coming near. It means it will all come to fulfillment in the timing of God. He is coming again. And we stand firm knowing that one day, not too far away, he's coming. It's near. Secondly, why be patient? Because God is accomplishing something in us. 2 Corinthians 4:16 and 17 talks about this idea. Suffering is a reality of life right now. It's a part of life right now, but not forever. The Bible acknowledges that there's ugliness and pain and suffering, but it also shows us that there's hope through all of this. It continually points us to Jesus, who suffered for us, who took a life of suffering for us. There's comfort beyond the suffering. There's hope beyond the pain. God is accomplishing something. There is something in the future worth the present pain. God is in control. His goal isn't to make us happy. His goal is to make us more and more like him. And so he's accomplishing that through us. And sometimes the suffering is a part of that. He's present through the suffering. He's carrying us through the suffering. He's walking with us through it. He's working through it all in us. Romans 8:28, which is often misquoted, says God is working all things together for his good, for his purposes, for our good, for his purposes. He's working through our suffering. The ultimate example is the cross. The darkest hour in all of eternity turned out to be the most beautiful thing. Came to give us hope that God will save us, that God will save us from suffering. God will save us from eternal suffering and hell. Just because we don't understand it, just because we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, doesn't mean he isn't in control. It doesn't mean he won't still accomplish his purposes in us. So God is accomplishing something in us. The third reason to be patient, because people require patience. And there's really not a whole lot to say about this. We require patience. I require patience to deal with me. My kids require it. We all require patience. People are hard sometimes. Be patient. Be dependable. Be agreeable. Work to make things work out with people. People require patience. And then fourth, because God's promises are true. We can trust that the promises that God makes, the promises that God gives us are true. That helps us sharpen our focus. That helps us trust. That helps us rely on God more. That draws us near to him as we persevere, as we know that his promises are true, as we know that his word is true, as we know that he can be trusted. What he has said will happen, period. So be patient because God's promises are true. And then he shifts gears a little bit towards the end of the passage that we just read. And I want to talk about this idea of being someone that other people can count on. Borrowing from Jesus, borrowing from some of Jesus' wording, especially in the Sermon on the Mount, James returns to the idea of consistency in Christ by hitting on swearing of oaths as an example of being double-minded. It undermines the credibility as we make unrealistic, heat-of-the-moment, hasty vows that can be easily broken. And he's saying, let your word be your word. Be someone that people can count on. Don't be someone who says things or swears by things that you can't control. Let your speech convey the integrity of the gospel. Let it be meaningful. Use your words wisely, knowing that your words can cause harm or cause healing, can point people to Christ and push them away from him. Make everything you say be true. Let your word alone be enough. Let it be something you can stand on. When you say you'll do it, do it. Because ultimately, the mouth shows what's in the heart. So stand behind your word as God does. Make it count. Live radically truthful. What is all this? How can we wrap all this up? What is all this ultimately about? Here's the thing. In suffering, which will happen, which is inevitable, which is a part of life, we can endure with patience. We can endure with steadfastness. We can endure with our eyes on the Lord because he is compassionate. He is merciful. He uses sorrow and joy both to conform us to be like Christ, to be more like Christ. Patience for a specific, particular, defined amount of time is what God is asking us for, because there will be a time when Christ will deal with it once and for all at a definitive time. It's like a painful health diagnosis. You know you have to deal with it, but you know that recovery is ahead, but you have to deal with it along the way. We can know the end with confidence, and that makes it possible to bear the things that we're going to face. we can be patient, knowing Jesus will return, knowing that our hardship one day will come to an end if we stand firm, if we're patient, if we endure.